Hello and welcome. My name is Bolid Meh. I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Every organization relies on a suite of enterprise application, collaboration tools, business platforms, and custom solutions that drives productivity. But with so many apps, how do you ensure secure access, seamless integration, and centralized management? Well, that's where Enterprise Application in Microsoft Entra ID comes in. In this session, you'll discover how to manage, secure, and streamline access to all your critical applications, empowering users while protecting your organization's data and resources. So let's get started. Now, in the previous session, we spoke about how to register an application. So if you haven't watched the previous video, I recommend you have a quick look. Now, after you've registered the application, this application is now part of your Entra Enterprise application because you've onboarded that onto your Entra environment. Again, you can go into looking at certain settings while we registered the app. Once the app is registered and now it's available for your entire enterprise application portfolio for people to access, you can go and configure some more details. Now, in this part of the session, we'll have a look at some more details around that, and we'll go and configure some settings in it. Now, before I do, two very important topics to kind of remind everyone that we discussed in the previous session would be to understand what is an application ID and object ID. Application ID is a globally unique identifier assigned to an app registration in Microsoft Entra ID. Think of it as the app's passport number. It's used by the app itself and by the other services to identify the app across all the tenants and environments. For example, when you configure authentication or API access, you'll often need to provide the application an ID so that Microsoft Entra ID knows exactly which app you're referring to. The object ID, on the other hand, is a unique identifier for a specific instance of an object within your Entra directory. This could be an application, a user, a group, or a service principal. The object ID is used internally by the Entra ID for managing and referencing the objects within your tenant. For example, if you want to assign roles, set access policies, or automate operations within PowerShell, you use the object ID to target that exact object in your directory. Now, with that being said, let's jump onto the portal and have a quick look at how we go into managing applications within enterprise environment in my Entra. Right, we're back into the portal. Again, I'm looking at my Entra Admin Center on entra.microsoft.com. And in the previous session, we registered an app called Ask Contoso HR. Right now, we're going to go step back out into the main blade for my Entra portal and have a look at my enterprise applications. Now, in my enterprise applications, we should be able to see the applications that we just registered. So we should be able to find our Ask Contoso HR app in here. Let's quickly do a quick search for it. There we go. So we have our Ask Contoso app available for us to look at under my enterprise portfolio. So if I go into this, and we can start looking at different settings that we have in here. Now, initially, when we registered this app, it had certain menus under the registration. So it's worthwhile understanding what areas can you amend while you're in the registration page to differentiate that from when you're in the enterprise area. Now, by all means, watch the previous session to go through the settings just to do a quick comparison, if you like. For now, we're jumping onto the menu that is in here for enterprise applications. Now, to remind you, we are looking at the enterprise application menu. So you can always check that by the top of the top left corner of your browser. And we're going into the properties. Now, this might seem very similar to the properties under the registration page. So we can still look at the name on the application right here, and we can look into changing it. We have the home URL for it. This is something that we can't change in here. We could in the enterprise, in the registration page. Here we can't. We have the logo. We can update the logo from here if we needed to. And then we have the application ID and the object ID that we just spoke about, both available for us to look at. Now, apart from looking at those details that we had, very similar to this in our registration page, there are 3 different items that are on the screen that we haven't seen before. So we are seeing them now. Let's highlight them very quickly so we can have a quick discussion of what these 3 items are and how do they impact me or my end users. Now, the very first thing that I have here is referring to enable users to sign in. Now, this is me toggling yes or no to allow people to sign in. Now, that's a very important part over here to begin this conversation. Without the sign in option enabled, no one can see this application or log into this application. Basically, this app is no longer available. Maybe I have a new version of an application that we've released and we've phased out the older version of the application at a point of cutoff when I don't want anyone to log into this anymore. I simply come to this and switch this app off. Now, I'm not deleting the app. Maybe I still need it for many other things, for auditing purposes, for analytics or whatever. I just don't want people to use this anymore. I can simply come in here and say no to this, and that would mean anyone that had access to this application will no longer be able to use it anymore. So I'm taking it away from people to sign into it. So that's something interesting to look at. Now, apart from that, there are a couple of other areas that we can look at. Things like assignment required, and also talking about the visibility to users. Now, to explain this, let me jump onto a slide and have a quick comparison between these 3 menus and how that works. All right, we're back onto the slides again, just to have a quick look at those 3 areas. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the first things that we had on the menu was to make sure that we have the sign in enabled. Without that being enabled, if I was to say no to that first menu, the rest of the 2 menus don't make any difference. People won't simply be able to log in or see the application in the environment. However, when we switch that on and say yes to that, then this is where the other 2 options that we had in the bottom of the screen come into play. Now, for the first one, we could look at as assigned user assignment required. This is where if I want only people who are assigned to an application to be able to work with it, I should then turn this to a yes. That means anyone that's not assigned to this application should no longer be able to sign into this. And again, that could be nice if you have certain applications for only a particular group of people or team or a project and certain resources that are allocated for them, then maybe switch this on and only add those people as assigned users in there. Now, just as a quick guide to look at this, one thing that's probably nice to highlight over here would be this, that when I'm talking about any of these options, when you look at unassigned users, now unassigned users in all the scenarios, they have one thing in common across, and that is that unassigned users can never see the application directly. Then they won't be seeing this application in the offerings, in the app offerings that they have in their profiles. So they can never see the app. All right, cool. That's good to know. Well, whereas when we have our assigned users, these assigned users should be able to see the application. And again, this is where the third part of this menu comes into play, where we can start bringing in the visibility. If, for example, for assigned users, if I have the visibility on, the assigned users can see the application. And if the visibility is off for them, the assigned users can't see the application either. So again, this is where the visibility only impacts assigned users in all situations. So if I have assigned users and the visibility is off, they can't see it. But if I have assigned users and the visibility is on, then they can see the app. Now, maybe someone is thinking of a question. What happens if they can't see the application? How are they going to log into it. So we do have people who can sign into this application. So if I look at this, we've already suggested in the very first menu, enable users to sign in. That means people can sign in. However, when you toggle the second option to say assignment is required, in that case, only people who are assigned can sign in into the application. However, people that are not assigned to this application, they cannot sign in. So this is where you are limiting on who can see this application and who can't sign in. So who can sign in and who can't sign in. With the visibility, if there is no visibility for signed or unassigned users, depending on when you say, hey, unassigned users, you can, assigned users, you can see the application, they can simply see the app, they can click on it, they can sign in. But if I say no to the visibility for them, how do they log in? Well, this is where if you have a direct endpoint for the application, they can simply click on it and they can get to the application, even if the application is not visible for them in their app portfolio. So again, same process will happen if I have the assignment requirement switched off and I say, hey, I don't need anyone to be assigned to this application. So people can log into this. Anyone in my organization can. Here, this is the trickiest part. If I have no assignment requirement in this case, typically, even then, only the assigned users will be able to see the application. So that's very important to remember. Unassigned users, like I started saying, can never see this application. Even though the assignment is not required, they will still not see it, given that the visibility is turned to yes. And they can sign in. However, because the assignment is not required, anyone can sign in. Even though the users who are unassigned, they won't be able to see the app. Given that they have the endpoint to it, they can simply type in the endpoint for the app and sign into it. Now, I'm hoping that makes sense to everyone. Let's move back into the portal and have a look at these three menus one more time. So this is where we can start looking at toggling the assignment to suggest, hey, who can sign into this application, or can I allow people to sign in? Say yes to that. Then after that, do I require assignment to this? Maybe I'll leave this off for now. So I don't want to limit anyone to see this application. I want this for everyone to work with. The last part is the visibility. Let's turn the visibility on. So later on, when we try to look at this application, we can see, hey, this is the app, and we can go into that. By all means, I can add notes here if I needed to suggest whatever, to again help people understand what is this application instance used for in my environment, and I'll hit save to that. Now, as a very quick test to understand how this would work, what we are going to do is we are going to start looking at logging in as a user to our environment and trying to see if we can find this application. For that, we'll need help of Frank, the user that we created earlier on in one of the videos in the series. So again, if you've been watching the videos from the start, you'll know that we started working with a user in the very first module, and we created Frank as one of the users in our environment. So all I'm doing is jumping into my Entra portal in Azure, and I'm trying to look for Frank. And I'll copy the Frank's user principal name, and we are going to sign in as Frank on a browser. Now let's open up in private browser, and I'm going into my apps.microsoft.com, a common link that anyone can try to find out all the apps that are available for you in your organization. So we'll type in logging in as Frank. Now this is my end user, so let's log in. Do MFA. All right, now we are logged in as Frank, and we are looking at the applications that are available for Frank to work with. Now, if I look at the app portfolio that Frank currently has access to, I don't necessarily see the app that we just created. Now, sometimes it does take a few minutes for it to pop up for the end users to work with. But if we go back into the settings to double check if we've done everything right, we've got the sign in correctly turned on. We've got the assignment is not required, so we're not assigning anyone here, and the visibility is turned on. yet we cannot see the app on this side for the user. Now, just to kind of remind you on why that is the case, so if I go back in here on the table, just to see what situation we are currently under. So if I highlight just the very bottom part of the screen, so this is where we are in. We've turned this on, we said no assignment required, and we said yes, the visibility is on. Now, why can we not see the application? Well, I'm hoping you can understand that this is the part that currently we are not assigned to this application. So unassigned users will never see the app, even if you've enabled it. So that's something good to bear in mind when you're configuring these in your environment. So let's jump back into the portal, and all I'm going to do is look at one of the menus that's on the blade. Apart from the properties blade, we're now going into roles, the users and groups tab. And this is where we go into adding users that we want to add. Now, again, it suggests that detail that we've just explained around the visibility right up there. So we know exactly what we're doing. We're simply going to go in here and add Frank to the list and suggest, hey, this app should be visible for Frank. Now, by all means, you could add groups or users, individual users, if you like. And that's a choice that you have in here. Now, one thing that we did earlier when we were registering this app, we created a couple of roles, and we created a role for an analyst. We created an end user role. Now, this is where it's asking me, hey, you're assigning Frank to this app. What should Frank be able to do? And that's something that we define under the app registration. We're now just assigning them in the enterprise applications. Let's give Frank the end user role. We'll go by least privilege access. We don't want Frank to write into this app. We'll select that role and we'll hit assign. And once we've added Frank to the list over here, now let's jump back onto Frank's app profile to see if that will pop up. And again, like I said, it might sometimes take a few moments to pop up, but we should be able to see the app coming up in here soon. All right, I've just refreshed the page and we can see the app has now popped up. Sometimes it happens pretty instantly and you don't have to wait. Sometimes it can just take a few minutes for it to refresh and come in. Sometimes the login, logout can help. So you can see now the app is visible for Frank in here. So Frank can go into Ask Contoso HR, and that app is now visible for my end user in my environment. All right. Now, apart from making this app visible and allow Frank to log in and add users or assign user to the application, we could still go in ahead and add owners to this, which we could do in app registration. We can simply go and manage the roles for this application if we needed to. The same process that we could do in the registration. So quite similar menus, but with some added options available for us to look at. Now, there are a couple of other menus in here, things like single sign-on and provisioning. Now, I don't necessarily have this particular demo app that I'm working with, the Ask Contoso HR, some of these features built in, so I won't be able to configure that in this part. So bear with me on that. I'll show you some of that in a different side of things. Apart from some of these, very quickly, right at the bottom of the menu here under the Manage, I have something that refers to the custom security attributes. Now, in one of the sessions during this series, we spoke about what custom security attributes are, and we added them to a user, and we went through a whole demo. So if you haven't seen the video on the custom security attributes, I recommend you have a look at that. Now, you can assign custom security attributes in here to an application as well. And again, in another video where we speak about conditional access, during the demo of the conditional access, I've demonstrated on how we can utilize some of these custom security attributes as part of conditional access policies as well. So maybe worthwhile watching some of those videos to get your head wrapped around on how we can utilize secure access or limit access to an application. Now, apart from that, we can start looking at certain other security aspects in here under my application. Conditional access policies are here. We've covered conditional access policies in a complete different video, so by all means have a look at that. But before we go any further, we have something under here called permissions. Now, I can go into this and start looking at permissions to work with my application. Now, under permissions, we have a couple of areas to look at One of them is called admin consent, and the other one is called the user consent. Now, for this particular application, if you were required to consent to any part of the application, any consent that the user has given or the admin has given, you can monitor that in here, and you can always go back and review the permissions around that. So, and you can revoke them at any point that you think, hey, we don't want this to work anymore. Let's revoke the permissions. So you should be able to watch or see some of that information in here. Now, let's come back out of this particular application and let's go back into my enterprise applications to work with. Let's have a look at some other menus under enterprise application. Right, so far we were under the same application, talking about the same application that we registered and managing that under the enterprise portfolio. Now, apart from just managing that, we can have a look at some other areas to understand within my enterprise applications. One of the key areas that we want to jump on first is looking at the consent and permissions from the blade. Now, this is where we can start looking at, hey, who can consent to these applications across my entire tenant, not just one application, because we're not inside a single application anymore. We're in the entire enterprise application menu. And in here, there are 3 different areas to look at. So we can look at talking about, hey, can my users manage this themselves, or do I need to do that? So we'll discuss some of these details now. So if I look into the menu for the user consent, we have 3 different options to discuss at this point. So first of all, let's see if I can squeeze this all in one screen. If I look at the very first option over here, this is saying don't allow or do not allow user consent. So this is where we want to completely lock down everything, and we don't want users to be able to consent to any permissions or any applications that require permissions to be approved. On the other hand, we can change this completely to say, all right, we are going to let Microsoft manage your user consent settings, and this is a recommended version over here. Now, this is automatically updated for your organization. Again, it depends if that's what you want to do. We do have one more option to consider, which is allow user to consent to certain applications that are coming from a verified publisher, well-known publishers. If their applications are within your enterprise portfolio, let people consent to it. However, what about the other applications that you might have in your portfolio? Or if you allow users to register applications themselves, then can they also consent to that? Well, this is where you can start looking at some more details. It says, hey, for consent for permissions that are classified as low impact, you can allow. So let's catch that all again. So we are referring to say we can allow users to verify this as long as it's a verified publisher. If it's not a verified publisher, then I am of a view where if it is low impact, that doesn't impact my organization as much, we'll allow them to verify this. Now, how do I define this? Well, we have a menu right here that says permission classification. So we can go into this and have a look. Now, some parts of these are still in preview. So we currently have the low area. So earlier on we said as long as it's low impact, we allow it. Now, how do we know it's low impact? We can come in here and define what low impact looks like for me, and it can add other permissions that are okay with you as low impact. So my users now would be able to approve verified applications coming from verified publisher, or any other application that's not from verified publisher, but it's only asking for certain permissions like, hey, just want to read the user data. So sign in and read user profile, profiles, view users basic profiles, view users email address, and that's okay. Maybe we could add other things to it. Maybe they want to read users' current location. Maybe they want to pick up users' current time. Whatever details you think are okay for you to give away for an application to request, and you consent to it. So you can make changes to that. So this is where you can go back into the user consent and check that area if that's what you were happy with. Currently it tells me I have 3 permissions in there that are classified as low impact. You manage that. Or else the recommended version where you can let Microsoft manage that for you, and you can read the documentation on how that works. Now, what if I go with the very first option? Don't let users consent to it. Well, what happens then in that case? How would that work? Well, typically this is where you go into the admin consent. Now, the very first part on the admin consent is the very interesting one. This is where it says user can request admin consent to apps they are unable to consent to. So this is where a user can say, hey admin, please help me consenting for this application. Now, typically when the user tries to log into the app, the very first thing they see is a menu that suggests, hey, you can't go and consent, you need admin consent. Click on this button to request consent from admin. Now, this would only happen if they have said yes to this menu, right? In the back end, if here you've said yes to this menu, they'll see a button here that says send a consent request to your admin. Now, if I leave this to a no, then in that case, you don't see that menu over here. You simply get an error message saying, or a message saying, hey, you can't consent to this. You need to contact your administrator and request. But doesn't leave you with any details on how to send that request. Maybe you need to log a call in your internal systems or log a ticket up for asking them for consent. So again, depending on how your internal system works, you can enable or disable this feature. Now, if you enable this feature to let people request for consent, you have some more options to explore from in here, such as who's going to be reviewing this when it comes to them. Or for example, when somebody can request for the consent, you can add users. There are some new options available under here. We can add an entire group, we can add an entire role. Maybe all application administrators for me can approve this consent. Maybe certain administrators can do this. I can define that. I can create a group of people who can add that group in here. Maybe there's one or two people that are managing these applications, so I can make them added in here to be approving all the consents that are coming through. Selected users will receive an email notification for requests. So we definitely want that to happen. Otherwise, they wouldn't know. Typically, if I'm sitting on my desk working and if I'm managing applications, I'm not looking at the request page all the time. I'll wait for an email to pop up and say, hey, request, and I can go into checking it onto that. So again, that pretty much would work with most environments. Then we have selected users will receive request expiry reminder. Now, again, if I haven't approved that request as yet, then it will remind me again, hey, someone has requested something, you still haven't taken an action. And further down, we have some more details on how long after someone's request this should expire. So the consent request expiry after 30 days. Now, that you can change depending on your needs. If it is a business critical application that my users need and they've requested for it, you haven't approved it for 30 days, surely there's something not right? Again, that all depends on what you're doing with that application and how long do you want people to respond to that. You can define all that as part of the setup in here. Now, for now, I'll discard these settings and we'll leave this out for now. And this is how you go into consenting for an application. Right. Apart from the consent to an application, we can also look at talking about another very interesting topic over here, which is looking at me connecting applications that are part of my on-prem setup. And if I want people to be able to access these applications, still using Entra and logging in from Entra, how do I make that happen? Now, we have over here an area called Private Network Connector, and we can start the conversation around that in here. Or if we go back into one of my applications that we created earlier called Ask HR, and under that, we have an area called Application Proxy. And this is where we can start creating details around a private network connector. So we can start creating that for this application. Now, what is an application proxy and how does it work? Let's have a quick discussion about that on the PowerPoint. So let's have a quick chat about what application proxy would do. Looking at this diagram, we'll break it down into parts on how to understand what application proxy does. First of all, this particular feature is an interesting one that allows me to access applications that are probably sitting on-prem, and for whatever reason, we are not migrating this into the cloud. Either it's a legacy application or for security purposes or internal procedures, we don't want to move this app from where it is, or maybe we can't. So we still want people to be able to connect to it. We still want people to be able to work with it. However, the app resides on-prem. Now, just to break down on what we're seeing in this environment, this dotted line over here represents my on-prem environment, and right over here we have some sort of a server, that's a web server that's hosting this API or application for me, and this is where the app lives. Now, if I want my user that's traveling all around using companies' networks or traveling about and working on remote sites, the remote networks, trying to log into this application, if I want them to have access to this application, one of the ways we can do this is create an application proxy for this app. To do this, there are a couple of things that we need. One, within my Entra environments, we need to download an application proxy connector and configure that application proxy connector. Typically, you will configure an application proxy connector in your on-prem environment on a resource that can handle that kind of traffic. Now, this can be a separate server. It doesn't have to be the same server where the web service is, but it has to be a resource that's publicly facing, can accept traffic over the internet. Now, let's assume we have another server over here that can cater for this traffic coming through. And this is where we'll go and plug in the application proxy connector. Now, while you download and install application proxy connector to this resource, also ensure that this resource is able to get to your web server. So basically on-prem networking, it's visible. Both of these devices can talk to each other without any further issues between them. Now, if on-prem, you require additional authentication methods, maybe you're using Kerberos, maybe you're using other authentication processes on-prem, your Active Directory on-prem requires you to do some of that. This is where you will define all these details when you're configuring your proxy connector on-prem. So as the connection comes through, if this application requires an on-prem protocol to authenticate something, or it requires additional details, then at this time, the AD can provide that information to the connection coming through, and you create all of that during the application proxy connector setup. Now, this is how the process will start, like we've done a few times before during the other explanations in this course. User types in the endpoint or clicks on the app that they have visible in their app portfolio. The very first thing the app would do is throw them to Entra to say, hey, authenticate yourself. And this is where the first step carries out. The app is now requesting user to authenticate. Now, when the user authenticate themselves by typing their username and password, or with whatever method that they're using to authenticate, now this generates a token from Entra and sends you all the way to the direction where your application proxy connector sits in. However, this is carried out by what we refer as an application proxy service, which will manage that connection from when you have an authenticated token that is going to bounce from Entra to the user, and from user all the way to where the application proxy connector lives. Once it arrives at the application proxy connector, it approves the token, checks if everything's okay. If it needs additional claims from the AD, it requests them at that point. And if it doesn't, or if it does, well, after it's gone through all of that, it will then redirect itself to the actual application that's sitting somewhere on your on-prem environment. And this is where the end user will get a direct or connection, and they will be able to work with the application in your environment. Now, hoping this explains on how we can introduce an application that sits on-prem into Entra and manage that for us in the cloud. You go and register an application, create an instance of that application in your Entra environment. You go into your proxy settings like we are right now. So all I've done is on my application page, simply going into the enterprise application, looking at that app that we've registered, and we are under the proxy. At this point, you can download the private connector for this. This is where it will tell you some instruction about, hey, this is what you need to do to configure this. And you can say, I've finished installation. Once you've finished installing this on your on-prem resource, again, these are some of the details that you might need to complete. And once you've completed this configuration over here, this should allow your users to click on this app and then be rerouted to your on-prem application that you've created on your environment. So again, this is application proxy. Now, apart from application proxy, let's jump back onto my enterprise applications for a minute and talk about some more options that I have available in here. Now, first of all, if I look at the top of my blade under my enterprise applications, I have another option over here to look at new applications. Well, this is not registering the applications, not really. We spoke about app registration in the previous session under a different menu. So what is this? If I click on the new applications, this is where Microsoft has built in a gallery of a lot of different approved applications, or these are this is a portfolio of verified applications that you have in your environment that you can simply look at to connecting them in your setup. They're pre-built. You don't need to configure them, install them, or do anything around them. You simply take them from the templates that are here and push them in your environment, and they should work straight away. Now, there's quite a few of them if you scroll down the blade and see different offerings that are there. Some of the interesting things around these would be that there are some of these that can allow your single sign-on federated services embedded onto them, or you could have auto provisioning available for some of these, which would mean I don't need to go and configure users, onboarding them, removing them, revoking their permissions, adding permissions to them. That can be automated as a whole process. Now, again, if you're looking to pick some of these applications from in here, you can. The process is straightforward. I can go into clicking on one of these applications from in here, making sure that I can give it a name if I don't want that name over here. Maybe this is something that I use for an internal process. Maybe I have multiple instances of the same solution that's in here. I call it a different name because they do different things for me. And I can simply hit create onto this. And this is where I can start bringing this application available in my enterprise application to work with. I will just give it a minute for it to configure. Seems like it's completed the configuration for it. Now I'm back into the application for Adobe Identity Management that we just triggered. Again, the settings for these is pretty much similar to our application that we went into in the enterprise menu. However, the couple of menus that we can have a quick look at. Now this is where you can click and trigger a single sign-on. This particular application allows single sign-on feature available. So you can go into enabling them by going into SAML and configuring that, or going into LinkedIn, going into your linked profile settings and enabling them from there if you needed to. Now, apart from single sign-on, you can also hit provisioning. Both of these options were available under this application. So we can do auto provisioning here. Again, if you had some of these settings available, you can simply start configuring that and define auto provisioning in here as well. So as and when you have people onboarding and leaving, their permissions, their access would automatically be configured. So you don't have to do this manually in your environment. Right, let's take a step back. For the very last part to this, what we are going to look at, apart from managing different applications and looking at going into your enterprise portfolio, one last thing that we can do over here is simply jumping onto a feature that's right here called the App Launcher. Now, what is the App Launcher? Let me just jump back again to highlight where it is. So we are back into the enterprise applications, and we are just on the blade on the enterprise applications looking at an app launcher. Now, what is an app launcher? Well, this is where I can create a collection of applications for different teams. For instance, we have a security team, and there are certain applications the security team needs, and we are going to create a collection for them. Out of the 1,000 of different applications that my organization uses, we want to put them separate for them as a collection that they can use. So we can go in here and start creating a new collection. Let's call this as SecOps apps. So this is for SecOps team. Again, just for the SecOps. All right. Cool. Again, I'm sure you can come up with a better description so you know what they are. In my next tab where we have applications, we are going to click on add applications. At a random, I'm going to pick a few. So if I can simply start looking at, maybe we can bring the Ask HR app in here. So we have Ask Contoso HR. We'll add that. Let's add some more. Excuse me. Let's add the Adobe one there that we just looked at. Maybe a couple of other ones. Again, this is just randomly adding some details just to demonstrate on how this would look like. So let's drop in a few from here. They can have SharePoint, they can have Loop, they can have Engage, and maybe I'll give them OneDrive. So these are all the applications that we are adding for them. Again, you can rearrange them on how they should look like, which one should be on the top and bottom. That's entirely up to you. Next, I can create an owner for this app collection. So if somebody is going to constantly keep on asking me around, hey, can you add this app? Hey, can you remove this app? Can you move this app up and down? Instead of me managing this, I can simply say, you know what, since you are the owner of this part of the resource, why don't you manage it? And instead of giving them any management roles or role assignments, simply add them as an owner in here. They can manage their own collection and do different things to it. We can add different users to this. For just this demonstration, we are going to look at adding one of the users that we are working on already. So I'll go and bring in Frank just to show you, hey, how this looks like when Frank goes and looks at the applications. So we'll add Frank. But remember, if you don't have these people added in here, they won't be able to see this collection. So you can define who gets to see this collection in your environment. Finally, we'll hit create a review and we'll create this. Now, once this is created, hopefully if I jump onto Frank's profile where we were logged in before, we should be able to see, that's pretty instant, a tab appearing up on my screen called SecOps Apps. And there is that collection for the SecOps apps that we've created. And again, they should be able to see these applications in here. By all means, if I don't see the application in there, the one for Adobe, then just to go back and check, is a signed in available? Is it visible? Is assignment required? If it's not, then am I assigned to it? Because without assigned access, I won't see the app. So maybe that's something to troubleshoot and understand from there. Now, apart from that, instead of my admin creating these collections for me, as an end user, I can do that as well. So individual users can create their own collections. They can go into their own profile right here and start creating a collection. It's telling me to create a collection for HR as an example. Why not? So we'll go into creating that. And in here, I can go and say, hey, these are some of my HR applications that I need to add to this. And we can create that collection as well. And we can choose where this collection would be in my setup. And I can hit create. And this is where it generates that for me as an end user. I have the HR collection right here. Again, you can reorganize this. You can customize how things would look like for you. By all means, you can say, let's manage my collections. I like to see the SecOps right at the top and my all apps right at the bottom. And I can apply some of that in here to rearrange how I want to see these apps. Now, again, this is all end user management. However, if you are requested to create collections as an administrator, you would have to come here and do that in your environment from in here. Right. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into implement access management for apps. In this module, you've discovered the essential of access management for apps, explored the power of Microsoft Entra ID, and learned how to secure your organization with tools like Single Sign-On and Defender for Cloud Apps. Remember, mastering identity and access management isn't just about technology. It's about empowering users, protecting data, and enabling secure collaboration across the cloud. The skills you've gained here are vital for any modern IT professional. Stay curious, keep exploring, and continue building your expertise. Your journey to becoming a Microsoft Identity and Access Administrator is just getting started. This concludes our session. We encourage you to review the reference module, check your knowledge with the additional study material, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.